Hey guys, David the Fishing Pastor here, and it's time for Tackle Talk Tuesday. So welcome to the very first Tackle Talk Tuesday. This is the show where everything's made up and the points don't matter. No, I'm just kidding. That's Whose Line Is It Anyway? You get 5 points if you remember that show. It's a great show. No, this is Tackle Talk Tuesday. I announced this last week. Every Tuesday we're going to be talking fishing and fishing-related topics, and even maybe go a little bit beyond it, talk about doing some videoing and how to do fishing videos and editing and some stuff like that. I don't know, there's so much we can talk about as this develops. But we're going to kick off the very first Tackle Talk Tuesdays talking about one of my favorite ways to fish, and that is crankbait fishing. So spring is finally here. I'm really excited about this because I love crankbait fishing. I talk about it a lot. I do it a lot. And to be honest, I actually kind of crankbait fish pretty much throughout the entire year. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is because I have a ton of confidence with crankbaits. I feel like if I catch most of my fish on crankbaits, but also because the weather here where I live kind of allows for that. I don't get any snow or the waters don't freeze over here, so I can kind of fish it all year. Depending on where you live, you may not be able to do that. But there are some things that you can do in colder water. There are some things you can do in warmer water. But springtime is just it's kind of just right. Spring and fall are really great for crankbaits. And now that maybe your water is starting to unfreeze, or the weather's just starting to get a little bit more nice, or whatever it is, the fish are starting to move up into their spawning areas and their staging and all that. But I love, like I said, crankbait fishing. It's a really great way to cover a lot of water. It's a really great way to find fish. And especially if you have schooling fish, it's a great way to catch those schooling fish. And it's a way to power fish. I know a lot of guys, including myself, I love to power fish. I love to finesse fish. But if I can catch them on crankbaits, or I can, get them on a jig or something where I'm power fishing, I'm flipping and I'm pitching and I'm covering water, I'm making long casts, things like that, then it just makes it all that much more fun. So crankbait fishing is a great way to catch a lot of fish. So we're going to talk about different crankbaits today. We're going to talk about some different techniques and maybe even some of the gear that I would recommend that you use for crankbait fishing. So like I said, I've done a couple of videos on crankbait fishing before. I did one on fall crankbait fishing and just a general one on crankbaits a long time ago. But I want to focus primarily on spring crankbait fishing today. And I just kind of want to have this kind of dialogue or this conversation with you guys about it, because spring is such a really great time to pull out those crankbaits. And I know that if you go to the store to get some, you walk along those walls and there's just a ton of crankbaits, different styles, different depths, different colors, different companies, and there's all this different stuff, and it can be a little bit overwhelming, like where do I start, what do I do? And this is especially if you're kind of just getting into this. If you're already a veteran fisherman, I don't know what you're doing watching my channel. I'm just kidding. I enjoy having you guys here, and I enjoy the input that I get from you. But this is primarily for those who haven't done this or are just getting into this. And I'm just sharing what I've done. I'm just sharing what has worked for me with you guys. But all you guys are welcome, whether you're a beginner or you've been doing this for a long time. All right, let me get back to it. So one of my favorite things to do is throw some square bill crankbaits in the spring. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is they're coming out of that winter slump, if you will. I mean, they are so inactive during the winter. It's scary, honestly. They get real lethargic in the winter. They don't want to really move. But now that spring is coming, they're starting to get active again. They're going to start chasing the bait again. And the great thing is they're starting to move up. Either they're staging, or they're getting, they're staging, getting ready to spawn, or they're already in mid spawn. I don't think anybody's in post spawn. It's a little bit early for that, but they're already spawning, or they're getting ready to spawn. And so they're going to be moving up in the shallows especially, excuse me. And so throwing a shallow diving crankbait really works, because again, either they're wanting to feed now, and so they're going to strike out of hunger, or they're going to strike out of reaction. And so throwing a really good crankbait, putting a crankbait right in their face, a lot of times they can't resist that. It's coming by, and they have to nip at it. And you got some good crankbaits with some good hooks, you're going to hook them, and it's just a real fun way. The fight is fun. You know, they'll a lot of times they'll jump, and you just don't know if they're going to stay on, and it's kind of, you're finding them. It's amazing. It's a great time if you haven't done it. But like I said, as they're starting to move up, you want to really start to throw those shallow crankbaits. If they're not shallow yet, you can definitely throw some deeper crankbaits, some you know, mid-diving crankbaits. Those square bills are generally 2 to 5 feet, and you can usually keep them deeper if you fish them with your rod tip down. If you want them to go a little bit shallower, then you just lift your rod tip up. But if they're not very shallow yet, you can still fish these mid-diving crankbaits, and these have the rounded bills on them, a little bit longer usually, and then as they go deeper, then they get bigger and longer. But these are usually about 6 to 10 feet, so if they're still in that range, then throw on some mid-diving crankbaits. They do work a little bit differently. Where these really excel is as they dig into the bottom. You know, you're coming, and these have rattles in them. You can get silent ones too, but there's just this noise, and they can hear it underwater as they're coming, and they have usually these kind of tight wobbles, and so they're digging into the ground, and especially when you have something that looks like a crawfish, has kind of like a craw pattern. It looks like a crawfish digging into the bottom, and you don't have to fish them real quick. You can bring them back quickly, but what I found is when you take your time a little bit, usually that's where I get more of my bites. And so, like I said, as they're starting to get shallow, then you can use some shallower diving crankbaits. Like I said, about 2 to 5 feet on these square bills, and they're called square bills because they have a square bill. And these deflect really well off of cover. Some really great places to fish these is riprap banks where there's a lot of rocks, boulders even, places where there's cover, there's trees, tree stumps, tree limbs. And, you know, I know it can get frustrating because you can get hung up. And that was kind of one of my frustrations in the beginning was, man, I keep getting snagged, And I think at some point it's inevitable, you're going to get snagged. But if you just take your time, I used to try to go real quick, and then I'd feel something, and I'd try to kind of set that hook a little bit, and end up being a stick fish or something, you know, a boulder, and then goodbye lure. But if you just take your time and you kind of, you can reel and then stop and reel and stop. But again, where you're going to have real success with these is in the deflection. As they're coming back and as they're hitting things and they're bouncing off, a lot of times, you know, you'll say you have a rock and you deflect off of it. A lot of times there'll be a fish on the other side of that rock, or it'll be following it, and as it hits, that fish will come up and just smash your bait, and there's nothing like it. It's a really great fight, like I said. But the deflection is where these really excel. And taking your time, making sure you're hitting things, making sure you're fishing the right depth. If I'm fishing 20 feet of water, and I've done it, I've fished 25 feet of water, and I'm fishing a 5-foot crankbait because I know the fish are closer to the surface and I've been hit. But generally, that's not where you want to fish them. Like I said, it's deflecting off of that cover. It's tree stumps, tree limbs, rocks, all that stuff. And you're going to find that you're going to get some really good hits on these square bill crankbaits. Another really great thing to fish is the lipless crankbait, and the lipless crankbait, I think, in my opinion, is really my favorite lure. I think it's one of the most versatile lures out there, and I have fished them, and I've talked about this before as well. But I fished them everywhere. I fished them in rivers, I fished them in ponds and lakes. I've even fished them in salt water and caught fish. But they're just so versatile. First of all, the profile is very bait fish like, and if you have some good ones with some good paint jobs on them that imitate shad, or they imitate crawfish, or they imitate bluegill, or whatever it is, these can be some killer baits. I like throwing these. Actually, I throw these pretty much all year round. I just fish them differently. When it's colder or hotter, I fish them slower. You can. The great thing is these don't have lips, and so they're not limited to a certain depth. You can actually fish these in all columns, in the lower water column, the mid water column, the high water column, and then you can fish them in different ways. And they're sinking baits. The square bills, they'll float, and again, they're limited to a certain depth because of that bill. but these don't. And you can get silent ones, or you can get ones with rattles, depending on, you know, again, how finicky the fish are. If they're a little bit more finicky, same thing with the square bills, then try using silent ones, and they won't be as spooked when this really loud crankbait comes by. And different crankbaits have different rattles, different sounds, and you'll find kind of what works for you. But like I said, these are really great. You can either yo-yo them, you can fish them, you know, let them drop and then bring them up. You can bring them straight back. You can burn these. You can fish them slow. You can fish them on the bottom. I mean, really the possibilities are endless. And these are really great. Like I said, they imitate bait fish. I love fishing these, especially in shad lakes, as they just imitate shad when they have the shad pattern really, really well. But yeah, I mean, again, springtime, they're active, they're there. You can get them with these in deep water, mid-depth water, shallow water, whatever it is, and you'll be able to find them where they're at. And again, you can cover a lot of water. So if you're fishing from the bank, if you're fishing from a kayak or a boat or whatever, you're able to cover a whole lot of water using a crankbait, because you just cast and bring it back, cast, bring it back. You're not finesse fishing. You're not taking your time and shaking a lure where it's at and all that stuff. Even though I love doing that, there's just something real special about crankbait fishing. So when it comes to selecting crankbait colors, honestly, I would pick one up in every color. I do, at least. That's kind of what I do, as I just want to have something for every situation. And you'll find them in different patterns, and like I said, different colors. There's shad patterns and craw patterns and bluegill patterns. There's crappie pattern. I mean, there's so many different ones, and that's just going to depend really on a couple of things. It's going to depend on the water conditions of where you're fishing, and it's going to depend on the bait also of where you're fishing, or the forage for where you're fishing. If you're fishing more dirty water, that kind of chocolate milk or muddy water, then you want to go towards usually darker colors, you know, more towards blacks, things like that. What I found really works great for me is more of a kind of a chartreuse with a black back. This is what I'll generally fish when it comes to dirty, muddy water, not much visibility. Fish a little bit slower, make sure it has a rattle in it. You just want to get the fish's attention, because they can't see very far. So if they can hear it, if they can feel it with their lateral line, and if they can still see it in that dirty water, then you're going to have more of a chance of hooking up with something like this, or even like a black and blue type crankbait. You're going to have more of a chance of hooking up on something like that than you will on hooking up with, say, a shad pattern crankbait. Now, if you're fishing some stained water, but there's still some visibility, it's not super dirty, super dark, super muddy, or anything like that, then jump over to those bluegill patterns. Those will work really well. What works also is the craw pattern crankbaits. I mean, those do really, really great. And you know, you don't want to throw something super bright or super dark, because the fish can see a little bit more. As the water clears up, you want to have lighter colors, or you want it to look as much like a bait fish as possible. So as you get kind of to that clear water, then, you know, those whites, the shad patterns, even the kind of more see-through type crankbaits, things like that, as the water gets more clear, then that's going to work even better. They kind of get a look at it. Then you can start using, like I said, some crankbaits without the rattles in them, so that they're not as spooked, especially if they're very finicky, things like that. But like I said, it depends on the water conditions, but it also depends on the bait fish that you have. Sometimes, not always, because I have thrown shad pattern crankbaits in ponds and lakes that I know have no shad. I know that what they have is bluegill, they have crawfish, they have crappies sometimes, and I've caught them on shad pattern crankbaits. So it's not always, there's kind of this match the hatch debate. But if I'm at a lake that I know has shad, I'm going to throw a shad pattern crankbait, because the shad's usually going to be the general, the forage that gets eaten the most. So I'm going to throw a shad pattern. But you can always throw different pattern crankbaits. But it never hurts to match the hatch. It never hurts to make your bait look like the forage in the water. That's what they generally eat anyway. So if they see that, they may feel more comfortable, or they may look at a clown pattern crankbait, something they've never seen before, and they want to go for it. So just get creative with it. If one color is not working for you, though, make sure to switch that up and jump onto something that is going to work for you. The gear that you throw crankbaits on is also really important. This is my crankbait setup here, and I don't use braided line for crankbaits with bills. So whether it is a square bill or a mid diving or deep diving, I don't use braided line for them. I know some people do. I don't like to use braided line. It has no stretch to it, and so you run the risk of pulling the hooks out of that fish's mouth. So what I throw really exclusively for crankbaits is fluorocarbon line. Really, I don't really like monofilament. Copolymer I'll use sometimes, but generally is fluorocarbon line. And any reel that I have rigged up for crankbaits, I have fluorocarbon line on them. It has some stretch to it, not as much as mono. It doesn't float like mono. It's subsurface. It'll allow that bait to dive to its actual depth. And then generally, depending on the conditions, usually I'd say the sweet spot for me is 12-pound fluorocarbon line. You can go lower. You can do 10-pound. I've done 10-pound. I didn't really like it. And then you can go bigger too. But the smaller the diameter, usually the deeper that crankbait is going to go. So if you're using 17-pound line, for example, that crankbait won't dive as deep as if you're using 12-pound or 10-pound fluorocarbon. And so, just kind of like I said, the gear that you use, the reel is just a general, it's a 6:4 to 1 gear ratio. And so, it's just kind of that mid gear ratio reel. The rod is actually, I think, what's really important. The rod is a moderate action or a moderate fast action rod. And if you use an extra fast, for example, that means that the tip on the rod is what's really sensitive, what's really fast, and that's not really what you want. What you want is a rod with a good parabolic bend in the middle, something that's going to bend closer to the middle. And the more moderate or the slower it is, the more of a bend it's going to have towards the middle or towards the back. Now again, fast action tip, extra fast, real fast tip, but that moderate fast even, so that it bends closer to the middle, that's going to help you keep that fish on when you're fighting it, so that they won't be able to spit those treble hooks. Okay guys, so I think that's all I have for you today, and in order to avoid this video being like 30 minutes long, I'm going to cut it here. But if you have any more questions about crankbait fishing, or really just about fishing in general, or anything, just let me know. Just leave it in the comments below. I do a pretty good job of answering your guys' comments and questions. And I always look forward to hearing from you guys. But like I said, if you want to know more about crankbait fishing, or just want some advice on whatever, just let me know. And like I said, I'm going to do my best to get back to you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully this helps you out in some way, and it has increased your knowledge. Like I said, I love crankbait fishing. It's one of my favorite ways to fish, and I can sit here all day long and talk, and you can sit here all day long and watch, but the best way to get good at it is just to go out and try it for yourself. Don't get frustrated if you don't find fish right away, or catch fish right away, or you're getting snagged up. It's just all a part of the process. You learn from it. You learn what works for you. Find the cadences that work for you. Find the gear that works for you. Find what's comfortable for you. Find the crankbait that you like the most. Find the company of crankbait you like the most. There's so many different kinds, and I like it. There's so many different kinds that I like and that I have, but I've found specific ones to me that are my go-to, and that's the one that I fish mostly. It's usually tied up on my rods. But if I need to, I'll go to something else. But like I said, just find the conditions, and it's really fun. Once you hook one on, and let me know. I'd love to know if this helps you in any way, and you went out and crankbait fished and caught a fish or whatever. Send me pictures on Instagram, direct message me, whatever. I love hearing from you guys. So thanks again for everything. You guys are incredible. I hope you enjoyed Tackle Talk Tuesday. We're going to switch it up every week, and just try to do something different, sometimes outside, sometimes inside, live streamed, whatever. I'm open to whatever. I'm just really excited about this, and I'll let you guys know soon what next week's topic is going to be. Appreciate you guys. Like I said, you're amazing. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. Almost at 2,000 subs, guys. We're so close. So close. One more thing too. Pray, Fish, Repeat. I got to do a shameless plug. If you buy a t-shirt on the website, or anything on the website, I think there's a hat too, you'll be entered for the month of March to win a Cast King Mela 2 spinning reel. So make sure to go get yours. People are buying shirts. They're getting entered into the drawing. So make sure to get yours before it's too late. March 31st, I will announce the winner over on Instagram on a live stream. But they are on sale right now. So make sure to pick up your Pray, Fish, Repeat shirt. And then you'll automatically be entered to win a Cast King spinning reel. You guys are awesome. Thanks again. Remember to always pray, fish, repeat. God bless. I'll see you in my next video.